In this process of having a spiritual director, obviously, you also learn to listen, it seems, because you have an excellent model of listening. And I would just also remind our listeners that on this podcast, we do talk about clearance committees, and those are elders who will just listen to someone who's considering a life decision, and simply ask questions, and as a way of kind of honing that idea or that direction. And I think what happens in that process is that we get simply better at listening for God, and receiving His direction. So one of the interesting directions that you've gone in is to move, not permanently, but temporarily, out of nonfiction and into fiction. And so you wrote this book, The Light We Cannot See. Can you tell us a little bit as a writer, as an author, kind of how that came about?
I've been writing some children's books for a number of years. I had one that came out of me 10 years ago. I still haven't published it because I still can't get the rhythm quite right. And this one, felt like a download from heaven. I don't feel like I even wrote it. I mean, I know I did. I have, it on my computer, but it came. Some songwriters say that they wake up and there's a song that's just already there. And I feel it's more like that for me, that this, I had been playing with rhythm and rhyming in this other book that has yet to be published. And I don't know that I was really thinking too much. I like angels, so and I like children. I've been teaching in children. I wasn't looking for the story at all. I felt like it was just given to me, and as it evolves now, I'm just stunned at all the ways that it's impacting people. But I didn't. It was a gift.
Mm-hmm. And you have some points in there to share about heaven and angels. So what are some of those things?
Well, children are full of questions about heaven, and heaven's full of angels. The Bible mentions it, an angel 273 times. Did you know that?
No, I have no idea.
They appear like men. Some have wings, some have faces, some are invisible and only their voice is heard. There was Balaam's donkey and the angel. There was the angel at the Garden of Eden when blocking Adam and Eve from coming back. A bunch of them. And children's guardian angels, because all of us, I believe, and I think we stand on good understanding that all of us has been given a guardian angel by God to protect us. And Jesus said, see that you do not despise one of these little children, for I tell you that in heaven, their angels always see the face of my Father who's in heaven. And that's Matthew 18:10. So children want to know this. It's very comforting to them, especially when they're afraid of the dark. And then I also think it's helpful for them to imagine heaven, the importance of talking about heaven, because death and public speaking are known as the two great fears of most people. Mm-hmm. And by talking to children about heaven and helping them imagine it, we can help them kind of embrace one of the great truths of Christianity, that Jesus came as a path, the way to his Father in heaven, the way, the truth, the light, that death is not to be feared. The one who tries to make us fear is the enemy. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus wants us not to fear, but to have peace. And our ultimate eternal peace is in heaven. So if they know that from simple little stories, it's an easy thing for them to make that jump instead of the fear that many adults have learned from who knows where.
Mm-hmm. And you said you didn't quite know where the story came from, but do you have any angel stories you've experienced in real life?
I think so. There was, when my daughter was somewhere between 2 and 3, we had a gated backyard and she was out there playing. So I was in the kitchen. I could look into the yard. doing whatever. And the next thing I know, I look up and there's a man standing at the patio glass window of my deck, and he's holding my daughter's hand. I've never seen this man before. He looks a little like you. And he was dressed in khakis, like a little plaid shirt, nothing unusual about him, and a small build. And I ran to the door and slid open the door. And I was like, who are you and what are you doing with my daughter? And he said that I found her crossing Lake Street in River Forest. That's a fairly busy street that runs all the way down to Chicago. And that's also about 2.5 to 3 blocks away from our house.
Wow.
So I wasn't sure how, I didn't think I could believe him, but I wasn't sure why I should not believe him. And then there's a knock on the door. And so I go to the front door, I grab my daughter, I go to the front door to answer him. I said, I'll be right back. It's the police. Someone saw our daughter, and called the police. I assume, I don't know to this day why, but they had to report. And I said, she's fine. She's right here. As a matter of fact, the man at my back door is just brought her. So they left. And when I went back to the patio door, not 2 minutes later, he was not there. Mm-hmm. And I ran into the backyard to look down the alley because if he was walking back to Lake Street, I knew which way he'd go. Nobody in the alley. Went to the other street, nobody there. And I'm like, you can't walk in 2 minutes that fast. You just can't. Mm-hmm. And there was no other place for him to go. So I assume that is her guardian angel. It was the only conclusion that I came to, and that it was kind of pressing on my mind to accept it. And I was like, no. that didn't look like an angel to me. So, but there was a show on television that had angels that looked like ordinary people. And so I thought, well, maybe he does send us ordinary people from time to time.
I think so. And I think that's why the Bible talks about, that we've entertained angels unaware. Yeah, actually, when I was in high school, I was part of a Bible study that wasn't associated with my church. And there was a guy there. He was probably in his 20s, I would imagine. And nobody talked to him the whole night. And he was just kind of on his own. And somehow we wound up in the room together, like everybody else is getting refreshments or something. And he just starts talking to me. And it was just this like fountain of wisdom. And like at one point he pointed to this clock on the wall and he said, that clock is broken. It's not working right now. If God would come down right now and fix that clock, then we would say that he is the God of fixing clocks. And this is why God doesn't fix clocks. And I was completely blown away. And he left and we never saw him again. It was just the most interesting conversation. So you have, I think, the intention with this book of easing grief and easing loss. Where does that desire come from?
Well, I'm not even sure that was the original thought. It just felt to me like it was just a little angel story, and I don't know that, again, because I don't feel I generated it. I didn't really have an intention to help people with grief, although that seems to be God's intention to be with it. I do have some experiences with grief. My mother had a miscarriage between the 4th and 5th child, and my daughter's had a miscarriage. We've had, death in our family, as everyone has. But I think that was God's idea, that too many people, someone said, too many people carry a grief that's not able to be expressed. Someone said that it's almost taboo to be talking about miscarriage or um, even abortion. There's some things you just don't talk about. If you go back 20 or 30 years, we didn't talk about HIV. Or if you go back further, we wouldn't talk about cancer. I mean, that was like a big C word. You didn't even say the word. So I think this is God's way of saying that I don't want people to carry such pain in their hearts. I want them to, I made them for joy. And so giving this image of a toy store, nobody in heaven needs to have a toy store. Children do not need a toy store in heaven. I have no idea what heaven's like, but I know it's way beyond everything that we can imagine. On good word. But I think that because we can't picture what our little ones in heaven are like, we are in this awkward, unfinished state of grieving. And we're such a visual society now that if we could use a story like angels taking children to a toy store, everybody, especially children, understand toys bring children joy. My grandchildren thought, oh, those angels must really love those children because look how many toys they took out for them to play. So that image, I think, is God's way of saying, here's something you can focus on. Know that they are just in happiest moments all their time here in heaven until you see them again. And I think that's what brings some relief, that they can picture their child playing, and then the way that this illustrator has the angels carry these children is just it made me misty-eyed. So that whole image of love and tenderness comes across in this story that I think God wants us to know and to trust that all our little ones in heaven are very, very well taken care of.
And speaking of illustration, is there a story behind the hidden dove on every page?
Oh, I asked the illustrator. My grandson, one of them, has a book that they read, and there's a little hidden duck on each page. And it's totally adorable to watch him listen to the book, and he points with his finger every time a page opens where that duck is. And so I thought, I'm just going to ask the illustrator to put a little bird. I love birds. To put a little bird on and hide it on each page, especially for this one grandson. I didn't say anything more than that. He chose the dove, which is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. The dove comes upon Jesus when he's baptized. And I loved the idea that even if you don't understand the story at all, even if you can't read or have it read to you, this little searching for a dove hidden on each page begins to teach us that God is hidden in our life, right in front of our eyes, if we take the time to look for him. He wants to be found, but he also wants us to do the searching for it, to meet him halfway, or at least the 10% of the way, to start looking for him. And that begins that relationship, and that begins that opening of the spiritual senses, that seeking, that moving our will towards his, because this is relationship that we're teaching and learning.
Yes. So tell us, what other books are you working on now?
I have I'm writing a study guide for the memoir, God's Patient Pursuit of My Soul, because it's so dense with good stuff in there. So it helps open that up a little bit more for people who especially like to write down their thoughts, as I do. I'm working on another children's book. It's called The Grateful Boat, and it'll be released next year. And it is about a boat that's been abandoned during a hurricane. And it's a story told from the boat's perspective, that we all feel abandoned at some time. And how does God use us in that moment of abandonment that we only notice after the fact? And another book called Angels Come and Go, Don't You Know, which is a chapter book for people who would like to learn and hear a little bit more about angels. And a historical novel. I read this little bio on St. John Capistran. He was in the 15th century and became this great big saint. And it talked about how he had to annul his marriage in order to become a monk. And I was like, okay, so I know that he became this great big saint, but this little voice in the back of my head, and I'm trying to teach myself, keep paying attention to that little voice. It kept saying, what about the wife? So, he was called by God to go on, and he had a great, just glorious work in his life that God used him for. A very intelligent man, but gifted greatly with many spiritual gifts, including healing. But the poor wife, I'm still trying to even find her name. She's just not listed anywhere. And how do you argue with a man who says we need to get annulled because God doesn't want him, he wants other things? And I'm going, but what about marriage? I thought marriage was it's a good vocation. It's a good sacrament. So I was just pulled in to that story and have begun writing the story of this woman who was once married to St. John Capistrano in Italy in the 15th century.
That's amazing. Well, that's a lot to look forward to. I do want to give just the briefest advertisement for a group that we are both part of on Facebook, the 540 Club, 540. The assumption is, I think, that if you write 540 words a day, that you'll write 100,000 words in 6 months, and so that's a great goal to have. But it's a very encouraging group, and that's how we met. And so I encourage our listeners who want to be authors or think they are authors or already are authors to be part of that group. And I also want to remind listeners that we will have Chris's information linked into the description on the Moments That Matter page. So she's got, obviously, lots of information out there. And so if you want to not only find out more about her, but perhaps even contact her, I'm sure that she'd be happy to hear from you, that you heard about her on Moments That Matter or someplace else. So thanks so much, Chris, for spending time. I think we could do, many, many hours, as Scott kind of indicated. But at least this kind of gets us going, and hopefully there will be a moment in the future when another of your books comes out that maybe you would revisit with us and have another chat about that book.
It would be my pleasure.
All right, and thanks to everyone who's faithfully listened to us, and we just hope that you will always pay attention to the moments that matter in your life. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.